Hey, everybody, this is Devin. And once a week, we talk about love and relationships and how to have better love and relationships in your life. And this week, we're actually kind of continuing a series that we started last week. And as I put it down, The Romantic Traveler, 5 Love and Relationship Killers. Uh, this week, we're actually talking about fantasy. Um, as being sort of like the number one. It is not necessarily sort of like the chief thing that kind of kills our love and relationship, but it's absolutely sort of a major contributor. Um, so the important thing to understand is that there's 2 ways to look at this. One is sort of like the fantasy of the tall, dark, and handsome, and that's cool. And the other way is to look at it as sort of like, here's my vision for the, and I want you to understand that when you're sort of like considering what your vision is for the future, uh, I think that's a great thing. Like, I want you to have sort of like a reasonable expectation of what love is, and how to give and take within a relationship and what that relationship looks like. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a conscious thing. The fantasy part I'm talking about is sort of like when we look at a relationship and we're yearning for it, and we're hoping that when we get a relationship, all of our stuff will be fixed, that this other person will come in and somehow complete us and make us perfect and whole, and I'll never have a disagreement, and he'll be the greatest guy or the greatest woman in the world, and there'll never be any trouble. And that's sort of not a real thing. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the general fantasy, and the notion that we are inundated by magazine covers and all kinds of things in our lives that sort of suggest to us a certain measure of perfection, and that we as people should be striving for this kind of perfection in some unrealistic way. And if we get it, we're cured. We're done. Like, everything is just going to be great. That other person is going to only be compassionate when we need compassion, is only going to be loving and supportive under every circumstance, and they're going to be hot, like ridiculously hot, with a libido that we can turn on and off with a switch. And all of that stuff is sort of like, fantasy is sort of fun in that sense, that we can imagine that we have this sort of measure of perfection in our lives and we can attract that person. But the truth of the matter is, we're dealing with each other, and that is sort of like a flawed human, uh, irrational at times, filled with fear sometimes. Sometimes we're unbelievably great and we go far beyond what we can expect of ourselves. But it's really hard. So I've sort of made a little list here of things that I wanted to talk about. So how do we, and by the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about Kabbalah, but in the most general, generic sense. This is the tree of life. It's the Gra variation. You don't have to worry about it. It's not that all important. And yes, I made that in my wood shop. And it is kind of badass, I know. So the important thing to understand here is one of several things. If you believe in some sort of a divine God, cosmic soup, running the show sort of thing, great. If you don't at all, and you believe that we're all happenstance and you're an atheist, great. Think of this top part sort of like this higher aspiration of yourself as sort of your consciousness. And when I say consciousness, I'm talking about something that is present and aware and moving forward that way. I am also talking about God and the divine. It's down here at the bottom where, in terms of Kabbalistic interpretation, we're sort of like at the bottom, removed from these things at the top. So at the bottom, we're talking about things that are more confusing, more self-absorbed, things that are more about ego, and, to be quite honest with you, more about our sort of basic level of survival and humanity. So understand that most of the time we're down here, and sort of like our higher aspirations are way up there. And when we talk about fantasy, we're really talking about the ego-based stuff down at the bottom. And we're talking about the smarty pants stuff where we are at our highest, most conscious selves at the top. So understand, from, let's say, an atheist perspective, you may want to call that top part proactive consciousness. You may want to talk about it as measured ideas, like stuff that you've carefully considered. And the stuff at the bottom is going to be more about your reactions. And so when we're comparing sort of like having a fantasy view of life, that means we're taking sort of like the reactionary approach of, I just want tall, dark, and handsome. I want some hourglass-shaped blonde who's going to be perfect and fill all of my needs, and I don't even have to ask for anything, and I don't have to consider the other person's feelings or understanding, and they're just going to be perfect as is. And I think you can kind of get where I'm going here, is that even if you find that tall, dark, and handsome and that like perfectly shaped hourglass blonde woman walking through your door, they're still going to be real people. And they're going to be flawed, and they're going to be imperfect, and that's the part that you're going to probably want to love ultimately, is learn to love the other person's flaws. So getting back to the fantasy part, it's not only is it about the relationship, the fantasy part of the relationship, that really the other person is somehow going to fix us and all that other stuff. It's also going to be they're looking perfect, and they're going to be compassionate when we need it, and we're going to have all those wonderful things and no consideration for the other person. So does that kill your relationship when you are only thinking about yourself? Yep. Is it about the same when the other person is only thinking about themselves? Yep. And when we both have these ideas in our head of what perfection is supposed to look like, and that we want this perfection, it's going to be hard to see when you have sort of like a more average person walking through the door, but they have all kinds of wonderful qualities. But if you have it made up in your mind that this idea of perfection is really what you need and somehow what you deserve and what you will only accept in your life, then you're going to probably miss a whole slew of people. I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of like perhaps the biggest and most unbelievable fantasy things that many, many, many people talk about and ask about, because I have dozens of letters about it. It has to do with the ideas of a soulmate. The soulmate meaning that there's this one, and sometimes it's called the twin flame, and there's this one person on all of Earth waiting for you, waiting to be discovered, and it's going to be like a romantic comedy that your eyes meet and there's going to be a thing, and then you get connected, and that's the end of that, and it's just happy hunky-dory stuff forever and ever. I think it's a wonderful idea, but I wanted to read something to you. As many of you know, I compulsively study spirituality and religion, philosophy, particularly Kabbalah, almost with an abandon. This particular book is one of my favorites. It's called God is a Verb. And it talks about here. Rabbi David Cooper is, in my humble opinion, a genius, and one of the best books you'll ever find on this particular subject. And he writes, the original soul was described as having contained 613 limbs, representing 613 specific missions that Adam and Eve had to accomplish to bring about the rectification of creation. Each limb itself, a root which contained about 600,000 smaller roots, think souls. So when we multiply the 613 limbs with the 600,000 smaller roots, we derive that there's more than 3.5 billion soul roots as a total. Each of these billions of smaller roots, called the Great Soul, all of the Great Soul composed of 600,000 individual souls, each represented by a spark. When we calculate this, the number of sparks add up to more than 2,000 trillion despite this enormous number of souls, sparks in this accounting, all souls are still part of one family of Adam and Eve, composed of 613 primary limbs. All right, so that's kind of complicated, but what it means is there is an astronomical amount of potential souls in the universe. Of those souls, there's going to be part of like that same root. There's going to be a huge number of potential people that may not be your twin flame or your exact soulmate. They're going to be people that are going to be part of that larger soulmate thing. And I know what you're saying, like, and even with my wife, like, I love my wife, and I have found a spectacular one in a lifetime partner. Is she my soulmate or twin flames? Who cares? The distinction, even if she is, I don't really have a specific way of knowing. What I do know is that she treats me kindly, she treats me with love, she treats me with respect, and I do everything I can in my ability to offer her the same. And that's what sort of like building the love is ultimately about. When you hold on to the idea of fantasy and you cling too tightly to these ideals of what we think, a matter of fact, a friend of mine says, I have a misguided notion of what I think will make me happy. This misguided notion is like, when I was 11 years old, I wanted to play first base for the Dodgers. And I held on to that idea really, really tightly. And when I realized I really wasn't that good of a baseball player, I felt terrible about that, because that was the one thing. And so when you hold on to this one ideal of the thing that will make you happy when you don't know for sure, it's without question a love killer, because that means all those other people who come in who don't quite measure up to whatever exact standards you have are going to be out. So I would ultimately say, give yourself a break. Understand that there are loads of people out in the universe that will probably be able to give you a wonderful, happy, long-term relationship filled with love and laughter and all of that kind of great stuff that we all crave. So understand that. So how do you get out of this fantasy thing? Know that there are a truckload of potentially wonderful partners. Understand that if you are sort of like almost like a feeling, it's like the feeling that comes from down here, like, oh, I know I need these particular qualities. Know that you maybe don't need them. If you haven't gotten my book, Women Are Smarter Than Men, I suggest you go to devingallaudet.com and download a copy today, and it absolutely will give you specific things. But to get you started on that, I would start by making a conscious list of the kind of things that you know are good for you and the kinds of things that you know aren't. Do it in sort of like, shall we say, a sober moment, when you're sort of like together and you can kind of look at yourself with a little bit of distance. Because sometimes tall, dark, and handsome doesn't necessarily mean this is the right person for us. And that hourglass figure and all those kind of traditional ideas of what we think women are supposed to be are really false, and they're unreasonable, and they're not right, and they probably prevent us from love. So yes, have a conscious idea of what you want your relationship to look like in the future. And by that, I mean, what would you like to receive, and what can you bring to the relationship? Because it's a two-sided thing. The relationship doesn't work just because one person is doing really great and the other person's like really hopeful that it's going to be continuing to be fantastic. So get rid of the unneeded fantasies. Start connecting with sort of like either a divine entity, a space of love. Come from a space of your individual truth, which sometimes may take a moment for you to sit down into. Think about your highest nobility, whatever it is, whether it's God or stop reacting. But any one of those things are going to help you find the love and define the kinds of love and relationships that you want. So we are moving on to next week. We're going to get into, I think it's going to be history. Yeah, I'm about 80% sure. We're going to talk about our history and our baggage next week, what to do about it, and hoping you find more love in your life on a daily basis. And thank you so much again. Go go to devingalladay.com to see all of the stuff we're doing. This one's going to be like a 13-week, maybe 14-week series with Q&As and stuff. But until then, to read what we've been doing so far, come down here, join my newsletter, and thanks so much for watching.